webinar series, Soft Talk 5, Sacred Spaces, Sounds and Mother Earth. The Center for Soft Power is India's first center that is dedicated to the study of Indian soft power. It aims to map the various elements of Indian soft power by also carrying out research and engaging with practitioners and academics. Not being caged in brick, wood, and iron, Indian thinkers were surrounded by and linked to the life of the forest. The living forest for them, their shelter, their source of food. The intimate relationship between human life and living nature became the source of knowledge. Nature was not dead and inert in this knowledge system. The experience of life in the forest made it adequately clear that living nature was the source of life and air, of food and water. This is a quote from none other than Rabindranath Tagore. The laboratory for the scientific thought process of our ancient seers was, of course, in the lap of Mother Nature, amidst the green of the forest, with the sound of the gurgling rivers, the roaring of the predators, and the song of the birds, and the gentle caressing of the deer. It was in this environment that the Vedic lore was revealed to them. The Rig Veda, the Atharvana Veda, several Upanishads, and the Puranas are all replete with prayers and descriptions of Mother Earth, nature, our environment. They prayed for they knew that humankind would not thrive without her. They prayed so their descendants would learn to respect her and treat her well. Had we paid attention to their words, we would not need a celebration in the name of World Environment Day, for we would have revolved around and amidst her, nurturing her. We would not need green warriors, for everyone would have lived in sync with her. We are at a time of our lives when we have to think very deeply, change our ways so our future generations can live. In one of the Vedas, there is a verse that says there are three different kinds of beings. Ones that fly in the air, ones that habitat the forest, and ones that live with and amidst mankind. And it very clearly says that there should be a designated space for all these. Had we not moved away from our roots, I know we cannot go back in time, but maybe we should think of the wisdom that there was in this. We wouldn't be having a pandemic like we are today. And we wouldn't be, hearing about or arguing about or, the whole social media is filled with this elephant that was pregnant, that was killed with a pineapple that was stuffed with firecrackers. And what is more distressing is that very nonchalantly people have said that, oh, this is how they eliminate the boars that come into their field. Well, I do understand this is a very complex issue, but I guess we should, as man, be discerning so-called very advanced creation of the planet Earth. I think we should all start really thinking, have we given our animals space? Have we given them clean atmospheres? I don't know about that. Anyway, our webinar today is in celebration of the World Environment Day. And this is going to be a conversation between three people from many different backgrounds, but yet all very deeply in our culture. So we are going to see how the three of them can look at how our culture has made it possible for us to think about our brethren, the animals, or nature, the mountains, the rivers, our air, everything about us. So I will give a small profile of everybody, and after that we will watch a few minutes of Wild Karnataka. So the webinar today will be in two parts. The first will be a conversation between Sri Kalyan Verma, who is a wildlife photographer, a filmmaker, a naturalist, and an explorer specializing in environmental issues in India. He freelances with many of the world's leading magazines, environmental NGOs, and television channels like the National Geographic and the BBC. He was also a part of the team that produced the movie Wild Karnataka, which I already just said, and which we will see a little bit of soon. His conversation will be with three other people. Dr. Jayanti Kumaresh, who is one of the foremost Veena artists of India. She comes from a lineage of musicians who have been practicing Carnatic music for the past 6 generations. And she started playing the Saraswati Veena when she was just 3 years old. She's traveled all over the world, spreading the sonic beauty of India's national instrument. Dr. Chitra Madhavan has an MA and an MPhil from the Department of Indian History, the University of Madras, and a PhD from the Department of Ancient History and Archaeology, the University of Mysore. She is the recipient of 2 postdoctoral fellowships and is the author of 9 books. We also have another very special guest all the way from Vietnam. We have Dr. G.V. Harisha, who is at present the director of the Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center in Vietnam. Dr. Harisha is a researcher, author, editor, translator of more than 75 books on culture, philosophy, art, and literature. He is the recipient of Maharishi Badarayana Vyasa Sanman President's Award of 2018. He has received the Best Book Award for Dr. Ananda Kumaraswamy in the biography section by Karnataka Sahitya Academy. He is the founder president of the Veer Savarkar Sahitya Sangha Karnataka. We will now watch a few minutes of Wild Karnataka.
It has been a labour of love. Over 400 hours of footage shot by a new generation of India's best natural history filmmakers. Working in every habitat across 4 years to document and celebrate the spectacular diversity of a single Indian state. Karnataka. Despite the pressures of development and vast human populations, India can be proud of its enduring wild legacy. Nowhere is this more apparent than in booming 21st century Karnataka. But with the vision, sacrifices and continued commitment of the people, government, and especially the Forest Department, all may share in the future of such unrivaled natural history. We seldom save what we don't love. You have saved some of Asia's greatest natural spectacles for future generations to love and pass on. Wild Karnataka sends a message of hope, not just across India, but across the whole world.
Thank you. Thank you for playing that. We made that small behind the scenes for when we released the film last year. So, hello everyone. My name is Kalyan Verma, and I've been doing wildlife photography and filmmaking for last almost 15 years. And in this time, one of the things that I get to do is travel a lot. You know, I'm barely in Bangalore, and when I say travel, it also means meeting people from different backgrounds, different cultures. And over these years, I have found this amazing relationship that people have with wildlife. So just to give you a little bit background about the Wild Karnataka film itself, so I've been doing films for many years for, like I said, many international channels and things. At some point 5 years ago, you know, it dawned upon us that, you know, we should be making a film about our wildlife for ourselves. You know, unfortunately, I get paid to do films for mostly Western audiences, you know. So at some point, me and 2 other friends of mine, we decided that, you know, let's make a film which celebrates the kind of amazing nature that we have. And not just, I mean, although this film is based on Karnataka, but this can speak for the rest of the country as well. So that was really the idea behind this. And it took us 4 years of filmmaking because, as many of you know, wildlife, it's not always easy to get things. So yeah, over 4 years, it took us about 400 hours of footage, which we had to compress down to 1 hour. So it was quite a bit of a challenge to do that. But we were very happy because we managed to get Sir Dave Attenborough, many of you recognize, to narrate this film. In fact, what was very interesting was that David Attenborough is 94 years old now, and he only does 3-4 films a year. And so I told him, you really have to celebrate and participate in this because it's a non-profit project, and we wanted him to come on board. And one of the things I've told him is that, India as a country, I think we are number one in the world when it comes to conservation. Of course, you hear sometimes not so happy stories like this elephant that got blown up. But that said, considering we have 1.3 billion people, and the amount of poverty and things, we managed to say we had only one extinction of animal in our country compared to any other countries. So I really think that because of our cultural heritage and the relationship that traditionally people have with wildlife is what saves it. So I want to tell 2 anecdotes during this filming of Wild Karnataka. One of them you saw was this animal called jungle cat, which is very rare to normally find. I've never seen it in a forest and all that. And I was in this Koppal district driving, and this villager stopped us, and he saw this, we have cameras and all that. So he said, "Are you looking for some wild animal?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Oh, there's a den there. There's a den of this cat, which is in the middle of my farm. You can go take a footage of that." I said, "Great, let's go." And the farmer, he has only 4 acres of land. Okay. Even with that, he left around 1 acre of land around the nest because he didn't want to disturb the mother. It's quite fascinating because, people like us in urban areas, we are relatively well off and we can make these sacrifices. But somebody with just 4 acres of land, let go of 25% of his annual income just because of his mother nesting there. So I find that really, really fascinating. The other story I want to say is this was in Chikmagalur. We were in a forest, Bhadra Tiger Reserve, and close to it, we heard that these elephants had destroyed a crop. So I went there just to meet the person, and there was an old man and his wife. Again, he's very small holding. I think maybe not even 2 acres of land. And in that, half of it, he was planted paddy, half of it, vegetables and things for his house. And when I spoke to him, he was probably 70 plus. He said that his children have abandoned them. They've gone off to the cities, settled there. Just he and his wife live. Just the only income is the 1.5 acres. And the previous night, elephants had come and destroyed the whole thing. So he was telling me that, most farmers in India, they don't have money in the starting of the season, to buy pesticides, seeds and all that. So they take local loans. And although we in the city areas, we enjoy 9% interest rates from banks, they have to take it from local lenders who charge anywhere from 50 to 30% interest, So he not only had a loan, which he didn't know how to pay, his food, the grains for his home were gone for the year. And when I asked him, "Are you angry?" He said, "Not at all." He said, "Just the way I have to eat, the elephant also had to eat and feed its family." So he said, I'm not angry at all. In fact, at least somebody benefited, So it was quite fascinating. So it was really amazing to meet all these people and the kind of tolerance they have for wildlife, right? And some of them lose a lot of livelihood. In fact, one of the things I was talking to a researcher friend of mine recently, they said that in India, about 200 people die every year because of elephants. But in reality, apparently it's more than 1,000 people because those other hundreds of people, they commit suicides. And the reason they commit suicide is because elephant has come and destroyed their crop. They don't have money to pay to money lenders, and they don't know what else to do. So you hear a lot of farmer suicides, right? So trigger of that is for elephants, So it's quite amazing. And I really I find that in India, also the reason we have what we have is because of these traditional communities who had very good relationship with wildlife. So if you look at Bishnoi community in Rajasthan, they are the ones who managed to book the case against Salman Khan, for shooting the black buck. If you look at Gond community in Central India, Central Indian forest, they've been protecting this forest for centuries. In fact, the first conservation movement, I'm sure, which many of you heard about, is Chipko movement, right? Where this woman in the villages came and surrounded these trees from cutting. So in India, we really need to celebrate that, what we have, that culture of protecting our wildlife, treating them as gods and as family members. And even people suffer because of the wildlife, they still have empathy and passion to save the wildlife that we have. So, shall I go ahead with questions?
Yes, you can. You can still speak in between also.
Sure. Yeah. So actually, I'm very fascinated with the panelists here because, like Lakshmi had said, we all come from quite a bit diverse backgrounds. But what connects us is the love for the heritage of our country and the diversity that we have. So first, I would like to ask a few questions to Dr. Jayanti. So I have the first question I have for you is, how does Indian music create reverence and respect for nature and its inhabitants?
That's a beautiful question. I'm so happy to be here with you all. As I'm speaking now, there's a huge storm outside and it's lashing out rains. So I could lose power anytime. You can hear the winds. So I'm here right now. We'll see how it goes. So the two most important things when you talk about music, people usually say is melody and rhythm. So actually it is sound and silence. So only when there is silence, you can have sound. And this sound, particular sound, is of two types, which is called Ahatanada and Anahatanada. Ahata is man-made and Anahata is the sound of the universe, the Om that you hear, or when you close your ears, you hear a certain noise. That is the Anahatanada. So Ahata, again, is of two types. One is just noise, and the other is a beautiful nada. Nada means it could be from a bell ringing in a temple, it could be from a conch, it could be from cymbals, it could be from anything like that. So Indian music has believed very this concept of nada or nada upasana, or how do you celebrate this particular primordial sound called Omkara, and from that the Sapta Swaras have come. Now, the most inspiring thing for a musician is when you hear the sound of the wind, the rivers flowing, birds chirping, Vedic chants, temple bells, anklets clinging, and a far-off voice singing. So typically when we go to a setup like that, we feel very inspired to compose something and go on a trip with a raga or something like that. So the most important thing is not hearing, but listening. So when you actually listen to all of this, you get a lot of imagery. Just by listening, closing your eyes, you can make out where you are. You could be in New York, Manhattan, you could be in a temple in Tanjore. So the entire ambience of the ecosystem creates that imagery in you. So sound is the artist there. And great composers like Muthuswami Dikshitar and other people have referred to a lot of rivers in their composition. For instance, you have a famous composition, Tungati Ravirajam Bhajamana Raghavendra Yetirajam Bhajamana. So that is on the banks of Tunga. And then you have Kaveri mentioned. Tyagaraja Swami mentions Kaveri. And then you have Yamuna Nadi Kinare in Krishna songs. You have Tunga Tarange Gange. So the banks of these rivers have been a seat for the development of so many types of imaginations for composers. Not only rivers, also trees. You have references to Bhatta Vriksha when you talk about Dakshinamurti. Then you have in Tyagaraja Swami's compositions, Tulasi Dala Mulache Santoshamuga. And then you have, I hope you can still hear me. Yeah. Sarasi Ruha Punnaga Champaka Patala. So a lot of leaves, a lot of flowers, champaka, everything is mentioned in compositions like this. And Sri Muthuswami Dikshitar himself, he's like a National Geography channel. Each composition of his will talk about the temple there, the river there, which goddess is there in that particular temple, what vastra that god wears, what astra he has, and what is the practices of the people there. You just don't have to do anything. Take one of his compositions and you're all set. You've actually watched an episode in National Geography about that particular place. So he's so, picturesque in his explanation of all of that. And Saptaswaras itself is said to have come from the sounds of birds and animals. Sa from the peacock, Ri from the bull, Ga from the goat, Ma from the dove, Pa from the cuckoo, Dha from the horse, Ni from the elephant. I always wondered why Ni was from the elephant, but it is said that Ni came from the elephant. And most of our music instruments are made out of wood. Veena, as you can see, is made out of jackfruit tree wood. Mridangam is also made out of jackfruit tree wood. Violin is made out of maple tree wood. And the beauty is that that particular type of wood which is available in that area. For instance, a Mysore Veena, you will find rosewood, teak wood. If it is a Trivandrum or Tanjavur Veena, you will find jackfruit tree wood. Whatever was available there, that used to be used to make a music instrument. And for a Veena, we use the honey bee wax as our fretboard. It's not an acrylic or anything. It's as organic as you can get. It's just the honey bee wax, which you can just scoop out and lay the wax again. Another very beautiful thing where a particular thing that links all of us, it links sacred spaces, it links sound, and it links environment, is that the way we get the wood to make a Veena. So there's this huge jackfruit tree in a temple, and the temple bell is hung on this tree. And for years on end, this bell is rung, and the resonance of that bell gets on to the wood. So after 10 or 15 years, a part of that tree is cut and a Veena is made, or a Mridangam is made. So it is said to be carrying the resonance of the ecosystem, the resonance of the temple bell, and the resonance of the chants, which is why it is very esoteric and very special. Also, Ghatam, the clay pot, the Ghatam instrument itself, is a symbolism of all the 5 natural elements. It has earth mixed with water, kept in fire, and there is space inside, and there is wind. When you play, the air comes out. So it's the simplest instrument, but it is a combination of all the 5 natural elements. We have ragas that can bring rains, and I didn't play it today. I don't know why it's lashing out so much now. Raga Amrita Varshini. So Muthuswami Dikshitar composed Ananda Amrita Karshini when there was a lot of drought in that part of Tamil Nadu. And it is said to have poured and the droughts have vanished. Also, Tansen, he has sung Rag Deepak and lit lamps. So sound has this effect on the ecosystem. They say when you want to convey something to somebody, it's not what you say, but how you say that makes the difference. You may be saying a no, but if you say it in the sweetest of the ways, they'll probably mistake it for a yes. So sound has this particular effect on our psyche. And that's how you know someone is yelling, this is too loud. Oh, this is so harmonious. This is so melodious. Music is the 6th natural element. You can't see it. You can't touch it. You can't quantify it and say, I put it in this bag. You can just feel it. So it can transform the environment around you. if you have a little girl singing in your house, if you have chants in your house, something around the environment around you changes. It cleanses you inside and gives you this wonderful feeling. I want to conclude by talking about a particular piece called 4 minute 33 seconds. So this was a composition of one Mr. John Cage, who is an American experimental composer. So he composed this as a 3-moment piece. And the strict instructions for it was all the instrumentalists on the stage should not touch their instruments through all the 3 movements. So they would just sit there, they would look at the notation sheet and be quiet through all the 3 movements. So for 4 minute 33 second, this entire composition, they just kept quiet. And the piece consists of the sounds of the environment that the listeners hear while it is performed, which is, it's more than silence, because after a certain point, silence starts speaking to you. You hear what it says. So man has always ensured that sound and environment walks hand in hand through centuries.
Thanks, Dr. Jayant. Some fascinating insights there. I just want to add one bit is that I was talking about these local communities. A lot of them, they pass on their love for nature through songs. It's only through music. It's not written anywhere or whatever. It's through the oral culture of sitting around a fire and singing these songs is how they communicate to the next generations. So, Dr. Jayant, I have one more question for you. So virtually every Indian musical practice has adopted symbolic use of sound, right, to articulate the order of universe. So how does the cyclical character of music, time, connect to the cycle of nature?
In Hindustani music, they have morning ragas, afternoon ragas, night ragas. So when a child cries, immediately you sing Mama Madhava. So it is a Neelambari immediately. So if it is morning, you sing Sriman Narayan. It is the placements of notes in a particular way which makes it a bright morning, or it makes it dusk, or it makes it night. So everything in Indian way of life revolves around music, be it a childbirth, be it a death, be it someone leaving someone, be it a marriage. Every part of our culture has music in it. It's Gauri Kalyanam, or it is, oh my God, someone has gone away. So somehow this theory of karma, if you take a concert, if you take a raga alapana in a concert, we always come back to where we began. So it's the movement of our Indian music. It starts in a particular place, it goes through the whole journey, and finally you come back to the Pallavi, which is where you began. In a great way, you could say it is the karma cycle, if you were to link it like that. I think it's absolutely connected with our way of life.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Jayanti. So for the viewers here, we will take questions after all the speakers are done. So keep your questions for later, slightly later part of the session. So now I want to introduce you to Dr. Chitra, and her expertise comes from temples and history of temples and the diversity that they have. So Dr. Chitra, I have this question for you. Both the individual human body and the larger cosmic body essentially are made of the 5 elements that we speak about, right? Earth, water, fire, air, and space. How are these represented in our temples?
And thank you all for inviting me to this lovely session. Thanks a lot. So yes, answer to your question, taking off from where Dr. Jayanti left, it's the same thing. As far as temples are concerned, as far as our Hinduism is concerned, we are totally connected to nature, to the environment. And the Panchabhutas that you spoke about just now, Prithvi, Tejo, Vayu, and Akash, are connected with, as we all well know, 5 huge, very ancient, very hoary temples across South India, 4 in Tamil Nadu and 1 in Andhra Pradesh. And you have the Prithvi Linga, the Linga made of earth in the Ekamreshwara temple in Kanchipuram. Up water, Lingam, that is the Lingam surrounded by water, is in the Jambukeshwaram temple in Tiruvanaika on the island of Srirangam. Tejas is of course the Arunachaleshwara temple in Tiruvannamalai. Vayu is the Kalahastishwara temple in Srikalahasti, and Akash is the famous Nataraj temple in Nataraja temple in Chidambaram, where you actually can't see the main lingam at all. It's just space. And as Shiva is space and space is Shiva, you have to connect with your mind. So this is how the ancients' idea was of bringing people in connect with nature through religion, through the sacred spaces that are our temples. These are 5 very well-known Panchabhuta Sthalas of South India. Other than that, let's see how these temples were, where these temples were located. You have one famous one, the Tirumala temple among the 7 hills. And then you have the Ranganatha Swami temple in an island, huge island surrounded by the Kaveri on one side and the Kollidu Madhya. How picturesque, one on a mountain and one on an island. You have so many temples in India situated where rivers meet, 2 rivers, 3 rivers, Sangamam in Sanskritam and Mukkudal is Sangamam in Tamil. Ever so many, because the joining of rivers is supposed to be a very, very sacred confluence, extremely sacred. And there you'll have a temple, a big one, small one, etc. Temples by the side of rivers, ever so many. You can take hundreds of temples in Kashi by the side of the Ganga. Any river in India, any sacred river, any river is sacred. And along the sacred rivers, you have shrines, big and small. In fact, going back to history, there was a king called Aditya Chola, one of the early Chola rulers, and his inscriptions say that right from the Western Ghats down to his area, the Tanjavur area, he had built temples in stone, very clearly the inscriptions say, along the river Kaveri. So these were the sacred spots. These were what were chosen to put religion in confluence with nature. And that's how we existed. And then the concept of sacred trees, sacred groves, we gave so much importance to flora. Even today, when you walk into ever so many temples of South India, sometimes in North India also, they mark a certain tree as a sacred tree. Now, what's so sacred about it? It's sacred because its leaves or its flowers or sometimes fruits are offered to the god in the temple. It's also sacred because of the Ayurvedic properties it holds, the roots, the shoots, the berries, the fruits, the whatever can be used in the making of Ayurvedic medicine. Sometimes every part of a tree can be used in the making of medicines. So our ancients wanted to safeguard these trees. And what better way to safeguard it than to give it a religious tag? Not for a moment am I saying that they were not used for a religious purpose. They were. And in addition to that, they had medicinal value also. And in order to safeguard these trees, they said these were the sacred groves. For example, if you walk into this very famous temple in Mylapore, in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu, you have the Kapaleshwara temple. And the sacred tree of that temple is the Punnai Maram. I don't know the botanical name. It's the Punnai Maram. And if you go around that temple's prakaram, you will see a particular shrine which says Punnai Vananathar, not Punnai Maranathar. It's Punnai Vananathar, meaning that he is the lord of the Punnai Vanam or the Punnai forest. So this area once upon a time must have been a huge forest of Punnai trees. And then I hear from friends in a particular group, it's a tree saving group called Nidal, that Punnai tree was chosen as the sacred tree for the Kapaleshwara temple because you see originally the Kapali temple was very close to the sea and it's been moved interior now for various reasons. And that temple is able to withstand the sea breeze because other temples may not be able to, they may wither away if they are close to the sea, but this Punnai will not wither. And that's why this was an entire grove of Punnai Maram. Of course, we've done away with all that now. There is no forest, there is no jungle of Punnai trees. There is one solitary sacred tree, the Stalavriksham, inside the campus of this temple. And Dr. Jayanti spoke about the Vata Vriksham. I also want to bring into focus Vata Aranyam, that is a forest of Vata trees, banyan trees. In Tamil we say Alamaram, and that is in a place called Thiruvalangadu. Thiru sacred, Alam banyan Kadu forest in a place about two and a half hours from Chennai by road. And the god of that place, interestingly, is called Vattaranyeshwara, Vatta Aranya Ishwara, the god of the sacred banyan forest. Even now, there are a few trees over there, a few trees only. Most of the trees have gone. And inside the sacred space of that temple, you have the Stalavriksham, that is the Vata, that is the banyan tree. I also want to bring into focus the fact that our ancients had done so much for us. They have left sacred groves, they have left sacred trees, medicine that can be made out of it, all that is there. But unfortunately, it's heartbreaking to this. Unfortunately, today we are not following much of this. And that sacred tree inside the Vattaranyeshwara temple was unfortunately set fire to, because devotees were lighting lamps under it and the whole thing caught fire, and there's hardly anything left of it except a stump today. If you walk into the Chidambaram temple, the sacred tree there, interestingly, is the Tillai. We always call Chidambaram as Tillai. That was the ancient name. Now, Tillai is the mangrove. And you see, Ichabaram is a place very near Chidambaram that is known for its mangrove forest. Chidambaram once was also known for its mangrove forest till we did that entire forest away. We've done it away. But inside that tree, inside the sacred space of the Nataraja temple in Chidambaram, there was once a part of the mangrove forest. And even today, there is a small sculpture of a mangrove. It's in a panel. It's a sculptural panel inside the tree. That's why it's called Tillai Nataraja. That's why it's called Tillai Chidambaram. So these were the different ways by which we wanted to bring a flora and a fauna. Look at the walls of the temples. Look at the pillars of the temples. They are full of carvings of trees, of flowers, of creepers. The entire temple was believed to be, and using a technical term here, the microcosm of the macrocosm. This is a miniature universe. You have the principal deity, Vishnu, Shiva, Devi, whoever in the center, surrounded by Navagrahas, the Ashtadikpalakas, all the minor deities all around. And then you have the entire cosmos in there. Men, women, dancers, musicians, trees, flowers, plants, creepers, everything is there just to show you this is the entire universe that you're walking into, and step by step by step by step, leading you into the sanctum sanctorum, where stands the God, where is the God supreme. So this was the ancient Indian idea of bringing nature and religion, spirituality, all into one. Right?
Great, thank you, Dr. Chitra. In fact, I was very fascinated to hear about this, some of the sacred trees. I was reading actually some literature where they mentioned that many of the sacred, like the banyan, for example, in biological terms, they call them the keystone species. They are the ones that keep the forests intact, and it produces flowers, it produces fruits, which from mammals to birds to everything eat. It provides shade. So a lot of the cultural references to sacred trees have also got to do with, interestingly, with scientific thing, because these are trees that offer lots for many species. So based on that, I have one more question for you, Dr. Chitra. So, and this is related to more specific to wildlife. For example, why do animals and birds play such an important part of representation of the divine? How has this been translated into temple architecture these days?
Okay, well, once again, animals like flora are part of our religion. Almost every animal is sacred for us. Almost every reptile is sacred. Every amphibian is sacred in Hinduism. And we have to give them their place in society. And therefore, you have so many vahanas for the gods. Almost every deity has a vahana, and we looked upon them as divine, including the elephant. So at one point of time, all that was there. And the carvings of the animals on the walls of temples simply superb. If you go to many, not more, all, many of the ancient temples, the lowermost sculptures there will be of elephants, as though they are bearing the entire temple on their backs. So that is the animal with a lot of power and a lot of might. You also have rows of lions. You have rows of hamsas, the hamsatara as we call them. The hamsa, not to be translated as the swan of today. We all know had the power to drink milk and spit out the water and keep the milk content. and which is why it's looked upon as a very, very important bird. And we, mired in this universe, should take in everything that the universe offers us, spit out what is not good, and keep only what is good. So that's why the greats were called Paramahamsa, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, because they could do exactly this. I mean, we lesser mortals take in everything good and bad and keep it all inside of us. Why do we have reptiles? We have lizards on the ceiling. We have everything. All of it was considered sacred. It was a very inclusive society. Suppose a child was taken into a temple by his parents, her parents. Wouldn't the child ask out of curiosity, why is this there? Why is that there? It was the beholden duty of the parents to tell him that this is the entire cosmos. Look at it like that. There is nothing that belongs exclusively to humans. It's all part of the universe.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Chitra, for that. It's very fascinating. In fact, I never realized, but when I used to go to temples more often earlier, I'd taken a lot of photographs, of the sculptures, and you can really tell that animals are always part of the architecture, the design to communicate, the love for the nature that people have. So thanks a lot for that, Doctor. Yeah. And so next we have our fourth panelist, Mr. G.B. Harisha.
Namaste.
Namaskar. Namaskar.
Namaskar, sir. Great to have you on this session. So really looking forward. So
thank you, Kalyanji.
Yeah. So I have one question for you. So, India, we have regard for nature in all aspects of our daily life. Now, how has this influenced other countries, especially Vietnam, where, the cuisine, the literature, art in Vietnam has been highly influential from India. So could you share some of your work and insights of that?
Basically, India okay, thanks for that question. And I thank Center for Soft Power for inviting me and all the panelists. My pranams to you. Basically, India and Vietnam, we are having 2000 years of cultural connection. But we know the imprints of our imprints in India's imprints in Japan or in Cambodia or in Indonesia in a greater detail. But compared to Vietnam, normally we know Vietnam means Vietnam and American War, and not much. So therefore, when I came here and I am here as the director for Cultural Center, I had an opportunity to visit the central part of Vietnam. So central part of Vietnam is the heart of the Cham dynasty, where Champa dynasty was there. And that is one of the ethnic communities in Vietnam. So they practice most of the Indian traditions only till today. Their marriage customs, their burial of the dead, that is followed through the means as per the Indian customs, whether they are Hindus or Muslims. And Muslims means they were earlier Hindus, they are converted. Second one, the food system, for example, it is very near to the Northeast, to be precise. Neither to the South Indian nor to the North Indian. Northeast of our Meghalaya, Sikkim, Assam, Bhutan, not Bhutan. These areas, that is use of chopsticks, use of less oil, not like the South Indian curry or sambar or rasam. They don't have that concept of finally making one dish in the South Indian way. Of course, they have their own way of culmination for the food, but it will be, in our sense, it will be assorted. Means it will be liquid in shape, it will be like a broth. It will be separate, and sometimes, and they are meat eaters, and they eat fish or other kinds of things, including the beef. It is a staple food here. So except for that one beef part, rest of the things we can compare with the Indian culture. So that is how it is there. And now, earlier the Ayurvedic or the indigenous medicinal systems had an influence on the food system. And in the middle, due to overexposure to the westernization or to the other influences, it was less. But slowly, for example, Tulsi, it has gained momentum now in the few recent years. Some of the other Indian ingredients, again, they are coming back to the cuisine of the Vietnamese. So basically to say they use less spices and very less oil, and it is like Indian food is like a plate system, means our food is served on the plate. So for them thali, for them it will be cups and bowls, chopsticks. So this is how it is there. So means what is my nutshell, what I am telling, more and more we give importance equally to Brahmaputra culture. Means I'm coining the word, like we have Ganga based, we have Kaveri based. Also there is Brahmaputra. It has its own existence in Indian culture, in Hindu history. So somehow that has been in a way marginalized, knowingly or unknowingly. So therefore, if we really give importance to that, the land of seven sisters, so means I am talking in concordance with our cultural nationalism discourses. I am one among them. So we have to give little bit importance to that, natural little bit importance. Then we can very well appreciate the Vietnamese cuisines.
Great, great. Thank you, Dr. Harish. I have one more question. Actually, what we mentioned this link with northeastern India, the Brahmaputra Delta. You know, it's very interesting because I had made a film on Brahmaputra, you know, a couple of years ago. And one of the things I found in Myanmar and some of the, like you said, parts of Northeast India, most of them have been converted to Christianity there, right? But whereas in Vietnam, it's fascinating that, you know, they still practice a lot of these Hindu traditions. So, Doctor, I want to ask you, do they acknowledge and identify that it's kind of inherited from the Hindu culture, or do they feel that it's different?
So here, what had happened is, there are two streams of influence from India, which I will speak in the next part in detail, along with Dr. Chitra Madhavan. And basically, two streams of Indian culture came here. One is from the Vedic or the Hindu tradition. Another is Buddhism. Of course, Buddhism is a part of Hinduism in the larger perspective, as told by Ananda Kumaraswamy and others. So there, the Hindu influence, it is, we can say it is there in the forms of yoga. Today, practically if you talk 2020, it is there. And in terms of Ayurveda. These two things are very much, Vietnamese, they desire to have it more and more in their life system. So yoga, it is very well known here, and people, they practice yoga. They take it very seriously. And in the historical course and due to the geographical settings, they are early risers since it is the eastern direction. Normally here people can be seen on the road by 4:30 in the morning or 5 in the morning. Hundreds of people, not like only joggers or people who want to keep their health. Everyone. The street vendors, the flower market, everything is open and they will be very active. Because their breakfast is 7:30 almost. Means what is our coffee time in South India in today's world. And that is there because that is the one thing. And secondly, means to answer your question, influence of Hinduism is seen in Vedas, in yoga and in Ayurveda. Coming to Buddhism, our Buddhist masters from South India, from Kanchi and other areas, Vinitaruchi and others, they have traveled to the offshores of Vietnam 2000 years back. There's a very beautiful story. So what has happened, books about that, material about that is not much available in English. Little bit is available in French, and lot of literature is coming through Chinese to Vietnam. Because what happened, to put it very simply, the Theravada school, it came from directly from India. The Mahayana Buddhism, it came through China. And the Tantric Buddhism also traveled to Vietnam. The Tantra and Mantra part, which is practiced in Tibet, in today's Tibet. So these three are in alignment with the local tradition. For example, Mother Goddess tradition is very much there in Vietnam. So how do I categorize them in terms of their belief system is they are Shakti Pujakas. They are Matru Aradhakas. Because I am a student of Tantra Shastra, So I have made a work, probably next 1 year I am going to publish it. So means these four influences are there. Influences of all these Hindu tradition, and within that the Buddhist part, and thirdly the influence of the different schools of Buddhism, and they are well in coordination, means in friendly relation with the local tradition.
Great, Dr. Harisha. Thank you for those insights. It's really fascinating. So, folks, I think we have a little bit of about 5 to 8 minutes to take some questions from the audiences before we move on to the second part of the session. Dr. Jayanti, you have a first question from Rajesh. I don't know if you can read it, but Rajesh is basically concerned that with more and more youngsters getting into music, he's concerned about cutting hundreds of trees to make musical instruments. So he wants to ask you, what is it that eminent people like you and the music industry are doing to conserve the tree populations? You need to unmute Dr. Jayanti, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Now we already have fiberglass mridangams. But if you ask me, if the tone of the fiberglass mridangam is as good as the one with the jackfruit tree wood, I would say maybe not. But instruments need not necessarily be made every time somebody starts learning. So these can be passed over generations. So what, if you take a veena, I have the veenas you see are 50 years old, 60 years old, 100 years old, which was played by the previous generation. So we don't have to worry that youngsters are playing. These instruments will keep getting passed on from generation to the other. So now we are not only cutting a jackfruit tree, and we are planting more. For instance, we are getting more land and planting more trees just to make music instruments. So it's not like we go into the forest and chop off existing trees. We have a separate place where we grow trees just to make music instruments. And we don't chop off the whole tree. We just take a part of it and the rest of it grows back again.
Great, great. Yeah, I think it's important to understand that difference. You know, you're not cutting off trees like that, because we grow trees specifically to cut them also sometimes, you know, but as long as the larger forest cover is there. So thank you, Dr. Jayanti. So we can have more questions from audiences if they have, otherwise we move on. Venkat has mentioned, I think it's a comment rather than a question, has mentioned that Angkor Wat was in Hindu dynasty from 4th century to the 12th century. He says the Cholas were the seafarers on the 11th century. So he thinks that the Hindu dynasty came from Burma, where the Tripura rulers were there. So just wanted to add that comment. So we have a few more minutes if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, we can move on to the next session.
Kalyan, could you just share your experience with when you traveled with the Kurubas?
Yeah, so it's just fascinating actually. Kurubas is, if some of you don't know, basically this shepherding community in northern Karnataka mostly. They come to southern Karnataka also, and they're called Dhangars in Maharashtra, essentially the same community, but across different states. And what's fascinating about them is that they migrate close to 400 kilometers every year. You know, and these are pastoralists, and I worked with this community where some of extended family, you could say, you know, a family of 4 or 5 together, they manage 10,000 sheep, you know, and they travel. So for them, with 10,000 sheep, if they're in one place, they'll overeat all the grass, you know, they can't sustain that numbers. So to maintain those numbers, they have to migrate through the year. And it was fascinating. So I've spent a month with them, walking with them every day, staying with them. And it was fascinating, you know, because they really understand the land. And, you know, when we see shepherds, we think that, you know, they're just standing there and letting the sheep graze. But actually, you know, they almost have like a military precision, like almost like a control system. You know, they're watching every sheep, what it's doing. If something's limping, at the end of the day, they can take care of it. And they're one of the biggest losses they have is because of wolves in these landscapes. You know, wolves come and attack these sheep. Every night, actually, pretty much I was there. And again, this system of forgiveness, the system of all animals are equal is very much there. So they have this fascinating story that You know, I mean, historically, I mean, it's this thing that once there were two brothers, it's actually three brothers, you know, and one of them got greedy and cheated them, you know, and the two brothers killed the third brother because of that, and he went to heaven. And later they realized that he did not cheat. You know, he did not actually cheat, and they were mistaken. And they feel that the wolf that comes to eat their sheep is that third brother in the form of wolf, to teach them a lesson, saying that, for the crime they've committed. So it's really fascinating with that.
Venkata Varadan Raghavan.
No, in fact, that's the comment which I had said a little while ago. The Angkor Wat community of the Hindu kingdom was there from 4th to 12th century. 12th century, Jayavarman had a second wife who was a Buddhist, and she converted the whole thing into, the Buddhist. They went Buddhist after he married her. But they generally felt the Angkor, the Cholas went to Cambodia. That's how the Varmans came about, because Arulmozhi Varman is Rajaraja Chola, and that's what generally talked about in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu. But they became a seafaring nation only when Rajaraja Chola went across, and that was the 11th century. But this has been existent from 4th century. So this thing, the Burmans were the rulers of Tripura. You know, they are the kings of Tripura. That's a land route. Come down Tripura, Burma, and on to Thailand. And that dynasty probably came up because of these people. So when you talk about the Brahmaputra, connection, what is that? Whatever word used. So I think this is this, and somehow I've checked up and all over. There's never reference to any of this, because we always talk about, Varman. We went from, Arulmozhi Varman went from there, and then that's where they're Varmans. So this culture came in from the other way. I think that's my theory, but I've been trying to check this thing. I've not found any reference to this.
Can I answer this question, please?
Yeah, Dr. Chet.
Okay, so Varman is a suffix that is given to a Kshatriya, and this was there from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. It's not restricted only to the Chola Empire. Arulmozhi Varman was one Chola ruler who had the suffix Varman. You have ever so many Pallava rulers, Mahendra Varman, Narasimha Varman, Nandi Varman. You have the rulers from Kerala having the suffix Varman, and from Kashmir as well, all over India. Just like Sharman was the suffix of the Brahmana, Varman was the suffix of the Kshatriya. So it doesn't mean that all of the influence of Cambodia went only from the Chola times. No, we have temples in Cambodia that were far earlier than the establishment of the Chola dynasty in Tanjavur. And let us not for a moment presume that the Cholas were the only seafaring Kshatriyas in India. The influence to Cambodia could have gone from anywhere in the sea coast of India. It could have been from Bengal, from Orissa, from Andhra, and from Tamil Nadu. But we have to understand that there is a certain script that is used in the inscriptions of Cambodia. When Sanskritam is the language that is used there, the lipi, that is the script, is Grantha. And to the best of my knowledge, that Grantha script was in vogue only in Tamil Nadu, right from the 7th century onwards. And it is not completely exclusive to the Cholas. It was there pre-Chola. It was there with the Pallavas and the Pandyas. And we also know the Pallavas were seafarers. They sent ever so many ships to Sri Lanka and other places as well. So to put the influence of India in Cambodia to the Cholas alone is completely and totally wrong. It could be from any part of the east coast of India. It could have gone through Burma, but it could have also taken the sea route. Very safe.
Thank you, Dr. Chitra, for that clarification. So we're running out of time. So we have one last question we're going to take, and then I'll hand it over to the next session. So this question is from Mukundan, and it's for you, Dr. Jayanti. So I don't know if you've read the comment, but it's basically about evolution of the instruments over time. And so basically, can you read it, Dr. Jayanti?
So he says there are instruments that have evolved over the centuries. Some of them were Dravidian and evolved over the current day instruments in vogue. There are probably quite a few of them that have lost their presence over time. True. Can you list? Yeah. So yar was an instrument from which veena came. So there Sagoda yar, Magara yar, Mayura veena, you had Hamsa veena, and we had veenas made with the faces of animals like peacocks, like swan and all of that. Those things are not very much in vogue today.
Thank you, Dr. Jayanti. So sorry everyone, we are, I think, slightly running behind schedule now. So Mr. Vijay Lakshmi, over to you for the next part of the session.
Thank you very much, Kalyan, for handling this whole session. And I must say that the animals didn't call him. I was really frightened that he would say that, I'm sorry, I had to go somewhere, and he didn't do that to us this time. So thank you very much, Kalyan.